On the morning of December 9th, 1945, a cold wind swept across the German countryside near Mannheim, carrying the quiet emptiness of a continent just emerging from war. Along the N38 road, in what looked like a peaceful scene, General George Smith Patton Jr. sat in the back seat of his 1938 Cadillac staff car, expecting nothing more than a relaxed day of pheasant hunting. The war in Europe had ended 7 months earlier. The man who had driven armoured columns across North Africa and smashed German defences in Normandy and the Ardennes was now commanding a paper army. Still, that morning, Patton was in good spirits. His chief of staff, Major General Hobart Gay, was seated in the front passenger seat, while Patton sat alone in the back of the car, a 19-year-old private who had seen combat and had driven for Patton before. Ahead of them, a jeep carrying their guns and a hunting dog led the way, as if this were only a simple outing for soldiers who had survived history's storm. None of them knew they were heading toward one of the most persistent conspiracy-surrounded military deaths of the post-war period. 12 days later, on December 21st, at 5:50 in the evening, George Patton was dead. The official explanation was harsh in its simplicity. A low-speed traffic collision, seemingly minor, had left Patton paralyzed from the neck down, and he later died from a pulmonary embolism, a known complication caused by prolonged paralysis after the spinal injury. But could a man like Patton, an icon of speed, violence, and modern war, really die in such an ordinary way? For nearly 80 years, that question has refused to disappear. Was it truly a tragic accident, or was Patton silenced by hidden forces who wanted him gone? When we look at the historical evidence, the answer points clearly toward an accident. Witness statements, medical records, and the exact timeline all tell the same story. A truck driver made an unexpected turn at the worst possible moment, and Patton happened to be sitting in the wrong position when metal struck metal. Yet conspiracy theories remain strong. They feed on missing files, strange coincidences, and a deeply human belief that great men should not die ordinary deaths. This is the story of Patton's final 12 days, of the evidence we have and the evidence we do not, and of a truth that can feel uncomfortable. Sometimes history ends not with a grand conspiracy, but with a small accident at exactly the wrong time. The George Patton of 1945 stood at the pinnacle of military fame and the edge of political disaster. He had led armies to victory across North Africa in November 1942, through Sicily in July 1943, and in the long campaign across France and Germany that ended with his Third Army deep inside Czechoslovakia. His soldiers worshipped him, recognizing in his pearl-handled revolvers and profane speeches a commander who understood the brutal arithmetic of war. In one address to his officers, describing a flight over the devastation his forces had wrought, Patton's voice carried both pride and burden. "The first 4 hours," he said, "we passed over a destroyed land, utterly destroyed. You who have not seen it do not know what hell looks like from the top." He paused, then continued with the weight of command heavy in his words. "From Brest to various towns in southern Germany and Austria whose names I can't pronounce, but whose places I have removed, the trail of the Third Army is marked by more than 40,000 white crosses." Those crosses haunted him, though he would never have admitted it in those terms. Patton was a hard man in a hard profession, and he believed war demanded absolute ruthlessness. This conviction had created a pattern of controversy that shadowed his brilliant career. On June 27, 1943, days before the invasion of Sicily, Patton delivered an aggressive speech to his troops in which he used violent language that was later criticized. Some men took him at his word. After the capture of the Biscari airfield, American soldiers executed 73 Italian and German prisoners of war, a serious war crime for which the individuals involved were tried. 2 soldiers faced trial for this war crime, but the investigation into Patton's role was quietly dropped by General Omar Bradley. The incident was investigated, and the soldiers involved were court-martialed, while the matter was contained at lower levels of command to prevent wider damage to the army's leadership and public standing. Weeks later came the slapping incidents. On August 3, 1943, visiting an evacuation hospital in Sicily, Patton encountered a soldier hospitalized for combat fatigue, what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress. Patton, who viewed such afflictions as cowardice, struck the man across the face. Days later, at another hospital, he repeated the act. When a private explained he was there because his nerves were shot, Patton's fury exploded. "You ought to be lined up against a wall and shot!" he shouted, his voice carrying through the hospital tent. Only General Eisenhower's personal intervention saved Patton from being sent home in disgrace. Then in March 1945 came what some called the Task Force bomb fiasco. Patton ordered 314 men and 16 Sherman tanks to drive 50 miles behind German lines to liberate a prisoner of war camp at Hammelburg. The mission was a catastrophe. Only 35 men returned, and every tank was lost. What transformed a military failure into a scandal was the revelation that Patton's son-in-law, Colonel John Waters, had been held at that camp. The mission later became controversial because it resulted in severe losses and poor tactical results, and historians have since viewed it as a serious failure in military judgment, becoming a question that generated unwelcome press attention. Once again, Eisenhower chose to manage the political fallout carefully, keeping Patton in command because of his military effectiveness during ongoing operations, because Patton's Third Army was too valuable to lose over matters of judgment and propriety. Through all these controversies, Patton had been developing what would become his final obsession, a conviction that the Soviet Union, not Nazi Germany, represented the true threat to Western civilization. As early as spring 1945, when his units pushed into Czechoslovakia, he had begun making remarks that horrified diplomatic officials. He did not want to halt his advance at the agreed-upon boundaries with Soviet forces. Of the Russians, he said with characteristic bluntness, "I have no particular desire to understand them except to ascertain how much lead or iron it takes to kill them." His fellow generals held mixed opinions about him. Eisenhower, who had known Patton since their West Point days, understood his value even while despairing of his political instincts. After Patton's death, Eisenhower would tell reporters, "It is no exaggeration to say that Patton's name struck terror in the hearts of the enemy." British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, himself no stranger to ego and controversy, admired Patton and enjoyed his company. But Bradley, who had once served under Patton and now commanded him, disliked him thoroughly. British General Sir Alan Brooke assessed Patton as a dashing, courageous, wild and unbalanced leader, good for operations requiring thrust and push, but at a loss in any operation requiring skill and judgment. By war's end, Patton had accumulated admirers and enemies in roughly equal measure. By the end of the war, Patton had earned both strong admiration and deep resentment, a legacy shaped by his personality rather than by any confirmed plot against his life. When Germany surrendered in early May 1945, Patton openly expressed his desire to fight in the Pacific, believing that his Third Army should take part in the invasion of Japan. He was 60, but vigorous, eager for combat, convinced his Third Army should lead the invasion of Japan. The request seemed logical. Why would America's most successful combat general be left on the sidelines during the war's final campaign? Yet Secretary of War Henry Stimson decided otherwise. Patton would not fight in the Pacific. No official explanation was offered, though some historians have suggested that Patton had become too controversial, too unpredictable for the delicate political situation in Asia. President Harry Truman, who lacked his predecessor's warmth toward Patton, President Harry Truman, who felt little personal warmth toward Patton, privately viewed him as a commander who was highly individualistic and politically difficult to manage. The implication was unmistakable. Patton had become politically dangerous. While awaiting word on his future, Patton flew home to America. On June 7, 1945, he arrived in Bedford, Massachusetts, and was reunited with his family. Days later, he stood before 20,000 people at Boston's Hatch Memorial Shell and demonstrated again his spectacular lack of political judgment. Speaking to an audience filled with mothers and wives who had lost sons and husbands, in his speech, Patton spoke bluntly about how deaths in war are often pointless tragedies, a message that deeply shocked many in the audience. The collective gasp that swept through the crowd should have warned him, but Patton seemed genuinely unaware of his words' impact. He gave additional speeches in Denver, Los Angeles, and Washington, but press coverage grew increasingly critical. Eventually, Patton was ordered back to Germany to command the Third Army, which was responsible for overseeing Bavaria under the military occupation system, a position requiring diplomatic skill and political sensitivity, qualities Patton notably lacked. He was bored and restless, viewing denazification as unimportant compared to the Soviet menace. His attitude toward defeated Germans created fresh scandals. In a private conversation that found its way into newspapers, Patton had remarked that SS means no more in Germany than being a Democrat in America. Comparing membership in Heinrich Himmler's Schutzstaffel to membership in an American political party was not merely tone-deaf, it was offensive. Elements of the press, already suspicious of Patton's earlier remarks that seemed tinged with anti-Semitism, turned against him more forcefully. In late July 1945, Patton visited Berlin's ruins and recorded thoughts that remain controversial. "Berlin gave me the blues," he wrote. "We have destroyed what could have been a good race, and we are about to replace them with Mongolian savages, and all Europe will be communist." The quote captured his twin obsessions, Soviet threat and sympathy for Germans. He argued forcefully that America was punishing the wrong enemy, that US forces in Germany must remain at full strength. To Secretary of War Robert Patterson, he expressed bitter regret about territory returned to Soviets. "We have had a victory over the Germans and disarmed them," he said, "but we have failed in the liberation of Europe. We have lost the war." By September, Eisenhower had endured enough. He relieved Patton as military governor and assigned him to command the 15th Army, essentially a paper organization with no real authority. The assignment was meant to sideline him, but Patton's public statements continued. Evidence has since emerged that both American and Soviet intelligence had tapped Patton's phone. Whether either side was concerned enough to consider more permanent solutions remains a question that conspiracy theorists find compelling. December 9th dawned cold and grey across occupied Germany. Snow from the previous night dusted the countryside, and the air carried the sharp bite of Central European winter. Major General Hobart Gay had invited Patton on a pheasant hunting trip near Mannheim, the kind of outdoor excursion Patton loved, offering escape from paperwork and politics. The hunting party consisted of 2 vehicles, a jeep driven by Sergeant Joseph Spruce, carrying guns, food, and a hunting dog, and Patton's 1938 Cadillac Series 75, driven by Private First Class Horace Woodring. The morning began pleasantly. Patton was in good spirits, talking animatedly with Gay about the upcoming hunt and military matters. The cold was sharp enough that Patton moved from his customary back-seat position to the front passenger seat to warm his feet near the heater. The journey continued without any recorded sightseeing stops, as the group traveled directly through the countryside toward the planned hunting area near Mannheim. His lifelong fascination with military history ran deep. He believed he had lived past lives as an ancient warrior. The party photographed the ruins, Patton touching old stones and imagining Roman legionnaires who once stood there. Shortly after resuming their journey, they reached a military police checkpoint. The hunting dog, riding in the open jeep, was clearly freezing. The decision was made to transfer the animal to the warmer Cadillac, which meant Patton returned to his usual right-hand back seat position, with Gay beside him on the left. The small convoy travelled along a secondary road near Mannheim, moving through an area used regularly by US military vehicles. As the vehicles proceeded along the road, the jeep moved ahead while the Cadillac followed at a short distance. When the gates lifted, Woodring pulled away. About half a mile ahead, 2 US Army trucks sat parked roadside. They appeared stationary, perhaps broken down. Woodring thought nothing of it. Then one truck, a 2.5-ton GMC, Standard Army workhorse, lurched into motion and began moving toward them. What happened next occurred in seconds. One of the army trucks ahead made an unexpected left turn across the road, placing it directly in the path of the oncoming Cadillac. Woodring's hands tightened on the wheel. There was no time to brake, no time to swerve, no time for anything but impact. The vehicles collided at low speed, in an impact that would normally have caused only minor damage, hardly high speed, the kind of fender bender that happens daily on American roads without serious injury. But consequences inside the Cadillac were catastrophic. Patton, unsecured by any seatbelt, they weren't standard in 1945, was thrown forward. The force of the collision threw Patton violently forward inside the car, causing severe injuries to his neck and spine. His head struck with terrible force, opening a deep laceration from nose bridge to scalp. Blood immediately poured down his face. Gay and Woodring escaped serious injury, suffering at most minor bruises in the crash. Only Patton had been hurt, and catastrophically so. He slumped into Gay's lap, unable to move. His first words, witnesses would recall, asked if others were all right. When they confirmed they were, he said quietly, "I think I'm paralyzed." Woodring scrambled out and flagged down the first vehicle, an army ambulance, in what seemed an extraordinary coincidence. Medic Sergeant Leroy Ogden stopped the bleeding and helped transfer Patton carefully to the ambulance. Within an hour, Patton was being wheeled into the 131st Station Hospital in Heidelberg. At the crash scene, military police questioned everyone. Woodring reported that truck driver Technical Sergeant Robert Thompson seemed strange, grinning constantly, apparently unconcerned that he'd just injured a famous general. The military police investigation identified the truck driver as a US Army serviceman and classified the incident as a routine traffic accident. Thompson was 50 miles from where he was supposed to be, apparently on an unauthorized joyride. The investigating officers from the 818 Military Police Company concluded this was a routine accident caused by careless driving. No charges were filed. Years later, some investigative records are no longer complete in the archives, a common issue with World War II-era documentation, a fact conspiracy theorists would cite as evidence, though missing World War II records are unfortunately common. At the 130th Station Hospital, medical examination revealed devastating news. Patton was paralyzed from the neck down. Doctors determined that Patton had suffered a fracture and partial dislocation of the C3 to C4 cervical vertebrae, which caused severe damage to the spinal cord. The violent forward motion had compressed and twisted his neck, damaging the spinal cord at a critical point. Below that point, his body could no longer receive signals from his brain. A medical paradox puzzled the doctors. The collision occurred at low speed, as Patton's staff car was slowing on the road. Gay and Woodring had walked away uninjured. Yet Patton, in the same vehicle, had suffered catastrophic spinal injury. The explanation lay in precise mechanics. Patton had been sitting upright, unsecured, and the metal frame of the front seat partition was positioned at exactly the wrong height. When thrown forward, his head and neck struck in such a way as to cause maximum damage. It was, in a sense, extraordinarily bad luck. Specialists flew in from across Europe. Patton's wife Beatrice began the long journey from America. Patton remained conscious and aware, making sardonic comments about his condition with the dark humor soldiers use as shield against despair. Initial prognosis was uncertain. Doctors put him in traction, immobilized his neck, and monitored carefully. They told Beatrice they simply didn't know whether he would recover. Then, about a week after the accident, doctors noted some stabilization in his breathing, although there was no meaningful improvement in his spinal injury. Some respiratory muscle movement returned. Doctors grew cautiously optimistic. Preparations were made to transport Patton to the United States for advanced treatment. Arrangements for a special medical aircraft proceeded. Beatrice spent time at his bedside. According to accounts that emerged later, they talked about family, about the future. Patton maintained characteristic humor despite dire circumstances. By December 19th to 20th, plans for transfer were solidifying. Medical staff believed the worst danger had passed, that he was stable enough for the journey home. Everything was being arranged: aircraft, medical team, receiving hospital. Within days, they believed, Patton would be on American soil. But on December 20th afternoon, Patton's condition suddenly deteriorated. No clear medical explanation presented itself immediately. He began experiencing respiratory distress. His cardiovascular system showed signs of instability. The medical team worked frantically, but they were fighting a losing battle. At 5:50 p.m. on December 21st, exactly 12 days after the accident, Patton died. The recorded cause of death was a pulmonary embolism, a dangerous complication resulting from prolonged paralysis after his spinal injury, complications arising from prolonged immobilization and spinal cord injury. Medical staff were surprised by how suddenly the end came. Days earlier, he had seemed to be improving. Because Patton's death was considered accidental, not suspicious, no autopsy was performed. At the time, it was considered acceptable to forego an autopsy when doctors believed the cause of death was clear, and there were no signs of foul play. Doctors believed they understood what killed him. Complications from spinal injury had overwhelmed his system. This decision not to perform an autopsy would later become central to conspiracy theories, with theorists arguing that poison might have been administered and that lack of autopsy conveniently prevented discovery. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, Patton was buried at the American Military Cemetery in Hamm, Luxembourg, his express wish to rest among Third Army's fallen. His grave was marked with a simple white cross, identical to thousands of others. For all his fame, flamboyance, and reputation as one of history's greatest commanders, in death, George Patton was just another soldier among his brothers in arms. For several decades after Patton's death, most military historians described the event as a tragic accident and did not treat it as a subject of serious controversy. Military historians treated it as an unfortunate conclusion to a remarkable career. Biographies covered it in a few paragraphs: hunting trip, collision, paralysis, death. Statements from General Gay, Private Woodring, and medical personnel formed the basis of the official account and were treated as reliable sources at the time. There seemed no reason to question them. This acceptance was perhaps partly a product of the times. During the decades after World War II, public discussion in the United States often showed strong confidence in official government explanations, especially on military matters. People tended to trust authorities, particularly about military matters. The idea that the U.S. government might conspire to murder one of its own generals would have struck most Americans as absurd. Then came the 1970s. Vietnam, Pentagon Papers, and Watergate shattered public trust in government. Americans discovered their leaders had lied repeatedly about matters of highest importance. In this new atmosphere of suspicion, old certainties crumbled. Conspiracy theories moved from fringe to mainstream. In this climate, British writer Frederick Nolan published a novel in 1974 called The Algonquin Project. The book was explicitly fiction, a thriller loosely based on circumstances surrounding Patton's death. In Nolan's imagined version, a famous American general is assassinated in a carefully orchestrated conspiracy because he's become a political embarrassment. The novel took real details: Patton's anti-Soviet statements, conflicts with leadership, the car accident, and wove them into a fictional murder plot. 4 years later, the Algonquin Project became a film called Brass Target, starring Sophia Loren, John Cassavetes, and George Kennedy. The movie was not commercially successful, and critics were unkind, but its cultural impact exceeded its box office. The film presented the assassination idea to a wider audience and contributed to later popular discussions about Patton's death. The film presented conspiracy as plausible, even likely, with all the emotional power cinema provides. The conspiracy theory might have remained speculation and Hollywood fantasy, except for what happened in 1979. Former OSS operative Douglas Bazata came forward with stunning claims. Bazata had legitimate World War II credentials, highly decorated for work behind enemy lines. Bazata presented himself as a former OSS operative and described his wartime background in ways that attracted public attention. Bazata publicly stated that he had been given such an assignment, a claim that later became the center of intense scrutiny and debate. According to Bazata, Patton had become such a political embarrassment that the decision was made at the highest levels to eliminate him. Bazata claimed he accepted the assignment and carried it out by staging what appeared to be a car accident. The story received significant media attention and was reported by several newspapers and broadcast outlets. Bazata gave interviews, held press conferences, provided what seemed like specific details. The story spread quickly through newspapers, magazines, and television. Suddenly, the conspiracy theory had a face, a name, a witness claiming direct involvement. There was one problem: Bazata's story didn't hold up under scrutiny. Douglas Bazata's account of how he supposedly assassinated Patton was detailed and specific, which initially gave it credibility. But when those details were compared against documented historical records, witness statements, medical reports, timeline of December 9, 1945, the story began falling apart. According to Bazata, the first step occurred during the stop at Saalburg ruins. While Patton and others walked around looking at ancient stones, Bazata claimed he approached the Cadillac and jammed the right-hand rear window open approximately 4 inches to provide a clear line of fire later. The problem with this claim is obvious. It was December in Germany, cold enough that Patton moved to the front seat specifically to warm his feet. If one rear window had been jammed open, letting in freezing air, surely someone would have noticed. General Gay sat in the back seat for much of the journey. Neither he nor Patton nor Woodring ever mentioned an open window. The cold air pouring in would have been immediately apparent and uncomfortable. The second part of Bazata's story was even more problematic. He claimed he used what he called a rock-firing gun, some kind of special weapon that would fire a projectile designed to look like an injury from a car crash rather than a gunshot wound. When pressed for details, Bazata said it was made by a country whose name he couldn't remember. No such weapon exists in OSS records. No armorer or weapons expert has identified a rock-firing gun of the type Bazata described. More importantly, medical examination at Heidelberg documented Patton's injuries in detail: laceration from blunt force trauma and spinal cord injury. Published medical discussions focus on a catastrophic cervical spine injury with paralysis, and there is no reliable medical evidence in mainstream accounts indicating a gunshot wound or a hidden projectile. The injury pattern fits a scenario in which he was thrown forward and struck the glass and frame partition between the front and rear seats during the collision. The third element was Bazata's claim that the collision itself was staged. Technician 5th grade, T5. Robert L. Thompson was part of the conspiracy and deliberately swerved into Patton's car. But this doesn't match what witnesses observed. Thompson's behavior was odd, grinning, seemingly unconcerned. Woodring suspected he might be drunk. But being drunk and causing an accident is very different from being part of a carefully orchestrated assassination plot. Thompson was 50 miles from where he was supposed to be, apparently on an unauthorized joyride with two companions whose names were never recorded. This sounds like ordinary military indiscipline, soldiers taking a truck for a drive they weren't supposed to take, possibly after drinking, not like trained assassins carrying out a mission. The final part of Bazata's story was perhaps most sinister. He claimed that when Patton survived both shooting and crash, conspirators resorted to poison to finish the job. According to Bazata, Patton was given some substance in hospital that caused his sudden deterioration and death on December 21st. But medical experts who have reviewed Patton's case point out that progression of his condition was entirely consistent with complications arising from severe spinal cord injuries, particularly in elderly patients. Patton was 60, and his body had been through enormous stress. Medical reviews of Patton's case argue that his decline fits well-known complications of severe paralysis, especially a pulmonary embolism caused by a blood clot during prolonged immobilization, and this mechanism can explain a sudden collapse without requiring any poison theory. What conspiracy theorists really lack is any physical evidence contradicting the accident explanation. They have no weapon, no poison, no documents ordering assassination, no testimony from multiple corroborating witnesses. All they have is one man's story, Douglas Bazata, who and some later assessments argue that he went public in 1979 with sensational claims while he was frustrated and may have had financial motives. When Bazata made his accusations in 1979, several key witnesses were still alive. General Gay never wavered in his account that this was a simple accident. Horace Woodring maintained his consistent story until his death years later. Doctors and nurses who treated Patton never reported suspicious activity. Even Beatrice Patton, who would have had every reason to suspect foul play if there had been any, never suggested he was murdered. What probably happened on December 9, 1945, was this. Technician 5th grade Robert L. Thompson was driving a U.S. Army truck at the time of the accident. Military police later investigated the accident and treated it as a traffic incident caused by driver error. The truck was operating outside its expected area at the time of the accident, suggesting joyride rather than official business. As he drove along a secondary road near Mannheim, perhaps distracted, perhaps impaired, perhaps simply careless, the army truck made a sudden left turn across the road and entered the path of Patton's approaching car, just as Patton's Cadillac approached after being delayed at the railway crossing. Visibility in a 1945 GMC truck was limited compared to modern vehicles. The truck sat high off the ground with restricted sightlines. When Thompson realized a collision was imminent, he may have reacted by swerving in the wrong direction, turning left instead of right in a moment of panic. This kind of panic reaction is well documented in traffic accidents. The vehicles collided at low speed in a crash that caused limited damage to the cars, not fast enough to cause serious damage to heavy steel bodies. But inside the Cadillac, Patton was sitting in exactly the wrong position at exactly the wrong moment, upright in the back seat, unsecured because seatbelts weren't standard in 1945. When the car lurched to a stop, physics dictated his body would continue moving forward. He was thrown forward inside the car and suffered severe injuries to his neck and spine, and the angle of impact compressed and twisted his neck, causing severe dislocation of cervical vertebrae. It was rotten luck. A fraction of a second earlier or later, a slightly different angle, a different position in the seat. Any small variation might have resulted in a different outcome. But that's not what happened. A modern accident reconstruction expert examining available evidence would find nothing unusual or suspicious about this sequence. Low-speed collisions can result in serious injuries, particularly to unrestrained occupants. The fact that Gay and Woodring were uninjured is unsurprising. They sat in different positions, braced differently, with different forces acting on their bodies. Medical progression that followed was also consistent with spinal cord injury. After initial trauma, Patton's condition stabilized. Doctors did everything possible with limited 1945 medical knowledge and technology. For a time, it seemed he might recover partially. Then complications set in. His respiratory system was compromised because nerves controlling breathing originate in cervical spine, exactly where Patton's injury was located. When a patient cannot breathe properly, after several days of paralysis, Patton developed a pulmonary embolism, a known and serious complication following spinal injury. These are not mysterious symptoms requiring poison to explain. They are predictable, tragic consequences of severe spinal trauma in an elderly patient. Yet we resist this explanation. We want there to be more because we need there to be meaning in tragedy. The death of George Patton, swashbuckling, profane, brilliant, controversial, should have been epic. He should have died leading a charge or defending a position against overwhelming odds. To die in a routine car accident, killed by bad timing and bad luck, seems too small, too ordinary. This psychological need for meaning is powerful. It explains why conspiracy theories take hold and persist despite contradictory evidence. When presidents are assassinated, we want complex plots involving multiple shooters and shadowy agencies. When beloved princesses die in crashes, we want Secret Service agents and orchestrated murders. When legendary generals die in traffic accidents, we want poison and conspiracy and dramatic revelations. By any standard of evidence used in criminal courts or historical research, the case for accident is overwhelming, and the case for murder is extraordinarily weak. Yet conspiracy theory persists and thrives because it offers a more satisfying narrative than mundane truth. Was General George Patton murdered? The honest answer, based on careful examination of available evidence, is almost certainly not. His death appears to have been exactly what it seemed, a tragic accident caused by an unexpected turn at an extremely unfortunate moment, combined with extraordinarily bad luck. All contemporaneous evidence supports this conclusion. Witness statements, medical records, documented sequence of events all point toward accident rather than assassination. The conspiracy theory emerged not from evidence but from fiction, from a novel published nearly 3 decades after Patton's death, from a Hollywood film, and from claims of a single witness whose story cannot be corroborated and whose details contradict established facts. That this theory has taken such firm hold in American popular consciousness says more about our psychological needs than about historical reality. There are elements that leave room for uncertainty. Military police files are missing from national archives, though this is far from unusual for 70-year-old records. No autopsy was performed, which means certain questions can never be definitively answered, though lack of autopsy was standard practice for apparent accidental deaths. Thompson's behavior at the scene seemed odd, but odd behavior after a traffic accident, particularly from someone who may have been drinking, is hardly proof of conspiracy. We cannot achieve absolute certainty about any historical event to which we were not witnesses. We reconstruct the past from documents, testimony, and physical evidence, making judgments based on probability and logic. Historical probability in Patton's case strongly favors accidents. Evidence supporting that conclusion is substantial and comes from multiple independent sources. Evidence supporting murder consists of speculation, suspicion, and uncorroborated claims of a single witness whose credibility is questionable. Perhaps the real tragedy is not that Patton might have been murdered, but that he almost certainly wasn't. There is something profoundly sad about how he died. Not in glory, not in combat, not defending anything or achieving anything, but simply sitting in the back of a car on an ordinary December morning when an unexpected traffic situation unfolded in a way no one anticipated. Patton had survived combat in 2 world wars, had led armies across continents, and had faced down German tanks and artillery. And in the end, he was killed by a traffic accident that appeared ordinary, but under unusual circumstances produced fatal consequences. The irony would not have been lost on him. During that ill-advised Boston speech, he had once spoken bluntly about how death in war is often a pointless tragedy, a remark that deeply offended many listeners at the time. The comment outraged his audience, but there was a dark truth in it. Patton had no romantic illusions about combat. He knew death in war often comes randomly, senselessly, and he died exactly the death he had spent his life trying to avoid, a death that had nothing to do with his choices, skill, courage, or legacy. Just an accident, a moment of randomness in an indifferent universe. So the conspiracy theories will continue. They will evolve and adapt, finding new supposed evidence in gaps and silences of historical record. They serve a purpose. They grant meaning where there is none, transform mundane tragedy into an epic tale of shadowy conspirators and silenced heroes. They let us believe Patton died because he was dangerous, because he spoke truth to power, because he was too important to be allowed to live. That narrative is more comfortable than the truth, which is simply that he was unlucky. Until credible new evidence emerges, and it seems increasingly unlikely after nearly 80 years, the conclusion based on existing evidence is unlikely to change. General George Smith Patton, Jr. died in an accident on December 21, 1945, 12 days after a car crash near Mannheim, Germany. His legacy as one of history's greatest combat commanders stands undiminished, whether he died by accident or murder. In the end, we are left with this. A great warrior died in an ordinary way, and we have been trying to make sense of it ever since. Sometimes accidents happen, sometimes great men die in small ways, and sometimes the truth is exactly as mundane as it appears to be. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of World War II's most enduring mysteries, please subscribe to our channel for more historical storytelling. We bring you the untold stories, the controversies, and the human dramas behind the headlines of history. Hit that subscribe button and join us as we explore the past, one compelling story at a time.